hearings on broken treaties with Indian nations.
The headquarters of the Sioux people.
We're angry about losing our land, losing our language, being ripped off of our ability to live as Indian people. Our parents was telling us, you have to walk the white man road. Indian ways are going to be gone. Be a Christian. You know, go to school and learn that English, but don't learn your own language. We wanted to give our lives in such a way that would bring attention to what was happening in Indian country, and we were pretty sure that we were going to have to give our lives.
The protesters demanded one change close to home. Through a translator, the Lakota chief Fool's Crow called for the immediate ouster of Dick Wilson, the elected head of the tribal government there on Pine Ridge.
Wilson molested the Indians, sometimes threatening them and so forth. Before the sun set, we want him out of office, and there will be no trouble.
My initial reaction was, this is something way beyond my pay grade, that someone in Washington is going to have to handle this.
Not good.
The standoff was unfolding on the Pine Ridge Reservation, home to the Oglala Lakota, not far from where chiefs like Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse had once led their people into battle.
The Lakota, who Americans call the Sioux, are iconic in American history and the American imagination. These are buffalo hunters who lived in teepees, who were at the battle with General Custer. Nearly everything about the Lakota life is firmly implanted in the way that Americans think about Indians.
By 1973, the Lakota way of life on the plains was largely in the past. The Oglala Sioux tribal government ran things on Pine Ridge. And where traditional chiefs had once sought consensus, elected Chairman Dick Wilson ruled with an iron hand.
He was like a Chicago ward boss from the 1930s. Big flour sack of a guy, wore dark glasses inside and out, was fond of drinking, and brought all his friends and family and cronies into office with him, gave them jobs on the federal payroll.
On the Pine Ridge Reservation, as with most reservations, the tribal chairman and the council have a great deal of power to spread money around, to spread food around, or to withhold it, or to favor one part of the reservation over another, which is what was happening.
Wilson favored mixed-race, assimilated Indians like himself, and slighted the traditional Sioux who spoke their language, practiced their religion, and remained loyal to the traditional Oglala chiefs.
Do you get any help from the tribal council?
No. Dickie Wilson's the president here. He's the worst one, I think. I mean, he's the, I don't know, he gets the most favoring.
The federal census, I think every decade through the mid to end of the 20th century, show Pine Ridge as the poorest jurisdiction in the United States. So there's poverty, and then there's reservation poverty.
When traditional Oglalas challenged corruption in tribal government, Dick Wilson responded with force.
He had his own army, which intimidated the full-bloods mostly, the traditional people. His goons started beating up the people, and no charges were ever pressed. And if they did, it got thrown out of court. He controlled the whole reservation.
Some of the officers hated to arrest any of Dick's people, in spite of the fact that they did break the law. He helped me a number of times, so I felt that I owed him a loyalty. And so I didn't support everything he did, but irregardless of what he did, I still felt that loyalty.
Well, there's been a lot of accusations made here lately, and one in particular that upsets me is the fact that I am using a goon squad, so to speak. They are respectable and honest citizens of Pine Ridge.
Yeah. And we're all sharpshooters. I'm the goon squad. Come in. Go and get 'em.
In late 1972, traditional Oglalas came together to push for Wilson's removal.
They started a civil rights commission, Oglala Sioux Civil Rights Commission. And from there, they got the documentation of the corruption, of the misuse of funds. They got the evidence.
And eventually the civil rights, they had a stack about 1.5 inches thick of all the testimony and violations, civil rights violations. Nobody ever got charged.
Prompted by the dissidents, the Tribal Council held impeachment hearings in February 1973. But Wilson intimidated witnesses, strong-armed council members, and managed to survive. Many Oglalas felt they had one last, desperate option.
We've always been peaceful and pretty much mind our own business and making our living and raising our family. Law-abiding. Well, I believe that the time has come that we have to commit violence in order to be heard. Now, I don't want to see anybody killed or anything, but the time's going to come when violence might have to be committed in order to wake the people up.
By the second day of the siege, the spectacle of armed Indians holding a town and 11 hostages had put the U.S. government on full alert.
By this morning, the entire area was blocked off by police. There were roadblocks as far away as the Nebraska state line.
On the far rise is roadblock 1. We have further roadblocks around the perimeter, which encompasses approximately a 15-mile area.
The director said, tell Trimbach he can have anything he wants, which was pretty neat because that was like a blank check. So I had agents go up to Rapid City and buy every rifle that they could find in the city because we needed them like right now. So they came down and now we at least had rifles for protection instead of just sidearms.
The military response is overwhelming. It involves plans using the U.S. Army to put down this rebellion. Clearly, there are people within the federal government who see a need to take it to the limit.
I was awake and there was a deep rumbling, droning noise. And we were looking around and we were surrounded by armored personnel carriers, APCs. All of a sudden we saw these 2 fighter jets coming and they circled around. And from the south they just came right at us. We thought it was over. That's napalm. Dennis Banks pulled out his pistol and he started firing. Boom, 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 boom. Then they were gone. You know, it was that proverbial last act of defiance. You know, here's that little mouse, and here comes the big, huge eagle, and the little mouse is standing there like this.
On the afternoon of the second day, South Dakota Senators George McGovern and James Abourezk arrived. They hoped that if they could resolve the issue of the hostages, the crisis at Wounded Knee could be ended quickly.
When they came in, it was very newsworthy. They came in with the news media. That's how the networks got in. And they said, we want to see the hostages.
I thought it was a deterrent.
The agreement I'd had with Russell Means was that if we landed at Pine Ridge, he would release the hostages.
I have an indication through an intermediary that they will release part of the hostages.
And I said, well, where are the hostages? You're supposed to release them. You agreed to release them. So they're standing over there. So I went over and I said, you folks, we rescued you. You can leave now.
But not anywhere
If you
else
wanted
yet.
to leave the Wounded Knee area, could you go?
They're sitting there on pins and needles.
Asked Trimbar. We had the people with him and said that they can leave.
And Mrs. Gildersleeve, the matriarch. We're not hostages. We're going to remain here. It's your fault that these Indians are here. Have you listened to them? You know, we're not leaving because you'll kill them if we leave.
Once they realized no one was being held hostage, the senators hoped to persuade the protesters to stand down by offering to convene hearings on their concerns sometime in the future.
We knew that a put-off, a stalling tactic would happen once there was no threat to any other lives other than Indian lives. You are going to walk away from here and say after a while, Dokshialo, you know? And we're not going for Doksha anymore. We're not going for later anymore, Senator. I told you over the phone that I've bet, and everybody here and down there have bet with their lives.
AIM decided that their strategy would be to confront the government and try to win the public relations battle. Prior to that time, being a Mr. Nice Guy didn't really work with the government. They didn't give a damn. So that's the reason that AIM thought this was the way to do it.
250 armed U.S. personnel now surrounded the village of Wounded Knee.
I felt good. This is why AIM was alive. This is why we came to be. To stand up against the FBI, stand up against the U.S. Marshals, stand up against goons, you know, tribal police. And inside, we've got freedom. Don't let nobody in.
Since its founding in 1968, the American Indian movement had been divisive, its militant tactics controversial even among Native people. Created in Minneapolis by young urban Indians fed up with police harassment, the group had shown a knack for generating publicity. Members had seized high-profile symbols, Plymouth Rock, the Mayflower, Mount Rushmore, and in November 1972 had occupied and vandalized the Washington headquarters of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Weeks later, in early 1973, AIM took its campaign into the reservation border towns of South Dakota.
In those days, there was a tremendous amount of racism, especially in the border towns around the reservations. I mean, real racism, where Indians are practically invisible.
There was towns you didn't drive through, didn't go through, especially women. You didn't walk down the street of any border town by yourself because you'd be accosted by any white man that felt like it.
Just weeks before the occupation of Wounded Knee, a white man killed an Indian near Custer, South Dakota, 50 miles from Pine Ridge. When local officials charged him with manslaughter, not murder, 200 angry AIM protesters came to town.
And you charge a white man premeditated murder. You charge him with second-degree manslaughter. And we ain't going for it anymore. And I know this whole damn town is an armed camp.
Hey, listen, white man. I have had all the bullshit from your race as I can take.
When police barred them from entering the courthouse, AIM members forced their way in.
Open your doors up. Go in, go in.
Just as we walked in through the door, then we were attacked by law enforcement. We were fighting, and they come at me with the nightsticks, so I blocked it and took it away and started using it on them.
I know I was right on the steps, you know, and things were happening. We bloodied the guy, we took the helmet away, we bloodied him up. Then I ran across to help get gas from the filling station. We were filling up, making Molotov cocktails and busting the bottles on the building, and the fire just started on the wall and everything.
Protesters set the courthouse ablaze and left Custer in shambles.
There was absolutely an element in AIM that considered itself a revolutionary organization who were comfortable being around guns, who absolutely loved the idea of AIM being outlaws, who just wanted to get it on.
The confrontation in Custer caught the attention of the Oglala dissidents on Pine Ridge. 3 weeks later, when their campaign to impeach Dick Wilson failed, they asked AIM for help.
Calling an AIM is attractive, but it's a roll of the dice. It's a roll of the dice because where AIM goes, chaos often follows, so that when those traditional chiefs bring in AIM, they're doing this in full knowledge that as they go down the road, they don't know exactly what's going to happen.
The Oglalas had exhausted all legal options. They believed that to put an end to Wilson's harassment and intimidation, they needed what AIM could offer.
AIM can bring bodies, they can bring people. They have the phone numbers of people at TV networks who can get on airplanes and bring television cameras out. None of the established national Indian organizations can do what AIM does.
The American Indian Movement's motto was anytime, anywhere, any place. And that was the most important job that we could do, is to be where there was injustice and to confront it.
At a crowded community meeting, dissident Oglala's 5 traditional chiefs and AIM representatives finally arrived at a radical plan. Together, they would seize the town of Wounded Knee. They would force Dick Wilson from office and, for the first time in nearly a century, draw national attention to Indian concerns.
The Oglala Nation is at a crossroads that can change the course of history for Indian people all across the nation. And I would like to ask that the chiefs listen very closely to what is being said here.
There was this hesitation. No one could make a decision, and no one would endorse us. And then the women started to talk.
Ellen Movescamp, a founder of the Oglala Sioux Civil Rights Organization, argued in favor of occupying Wounded Knee.
This has been going on for a long time before we invited the American Indian Movement here. Because the people were scared, and they are scared of Dick Wilson and all his men. I don't see why all these people come from all over. I don't see why they can't take him and throw him out or throw him in jail or something, the way he's been terrorizing people here on a reservation. And I live in Pine Ridge at that gunpoint, but I'm not scared of them anymore.
She was pushing, and she was pushing to spark something, and oh, it did.
Finally, Fool's Crow, the oldest traditional chief present, spoke. Go ahead and do it, he said. Take your brothers from the American Indian Movement and go to Wounded Knee and make your stand there.
Today a teepee was set up in what is now called the demilitarized zone. Both sides are meeting there to negotiate an end to the takeover, but the progress is agonizingly slow.
There were negotiations going on almost always during the occupation. Attempts on both sides to reach some sort of agreement.
Government negotiators were uncompromising. They rejected demands to uphold treaty rights and insisted that they were powerless to remove Dick Wilson, regardless of the charges against him, as he was chairman of a sovereign Indian nation.
He's named you to the representative.
Talks stalled completely when the protesters demanded to deal with the U.S. Secretary of State.
I understand they want Henry Kissinger out here. Do you think this is realistic? You think he'll come?
Why not? You know, I don't see why the North Vietnamese should take precedent over the American Indian people. You know, we've been fighting this war for 400 years, and if he can spare the time to go over there, he should be able to spare the time to come here.
But it would be correct to describe the current situation as an impasse.
If there's such a thing as an impasse on an impasse, then that's what we have.
Officials from the Departments of Justice and the Interior took the lead in negotiations. The attention of the White House was elsewhere, on the unfolding Watergate scandal.
There was no question that the White House was distracted during this Wounded Knee siege. Although they sent mid-level officials out to run this siege operation, they didn't have their mind on it. Nixon had his mind on trying to survive the Watergate thing. Things might have turned out a lot differently had they not been distracted.
Turn that light out.
Within Wounded Knee, the days were relatively calm, while the nights exploded with gunfire.
Just take these unarmed men and tell them. Turn that damn light out, or I'll shoot the out.
They were shooting machine gun fire at us, tracers coming at us at nighttime, just like a war zone. We had some Vietnam vets with us. And they said, man, this is just like Vietnam.
There was actually a third force at Wounded Knee, in addition to the Indian activists inside of Wounded Knee and the federal marshals and FBI agents surrounding Wounded Knee. And that third force was the Goon Squad.
What is the mood among your people at this time?
They're very ticked off,
What are they doing right now?
shining their guns up.
As tribal chairman, Wilson wielded supreme authority on Pine Ridge. He erected his own roadblocks outside the federal perimeter. Even U.S. officials had to go through him.
As far as you're going?
Well, I want them to go in. And I'm
You're gonna have to get Wilson.
Well, then you'll have to get in, because I'm taking them in.
And you're who?
I'm Wayne Colburn, the director of the U.S. Marshal Service.
Well, what do you think? Should let him in?
These goons were armed, and they frequently got in between the federal lines and the Wounded Knee perimeter and shot in both directions with the intent of provoking firefights, because they were angry that the government didn't go in and take over Wounded Knee.
Inside the village, the protesters had their own military operation, led by Indians trained by the government they now took up arms against.
There was a lot of people there that had been in Vietnam, and a lot of people had just been in the military. Some older people had come in, and they'd actually been in Korea. They knew how to give orders, they knew how to take orders, and they knew how to do things that they didn't have to be told twice.
I knew we were making history for our people. It didn't all happen in the 1800s. We're still fighting in the modern day. I mean, that's how I felt, that it was a continuation, and that's why I was not afraid. I was not afraid.
In the 19th century, the Lakota fought furiously to defend their territory against relentless American expansion. In 1868, embattled Lakota chiefs signed the Fort Laramie Treaty to protect more than 30 million acres of their land. But the United States soon reneged and forced the Lakota onto small, desolate reservations.
Americans like to think that American Indian history is something in the past. I'm one generation removed from the genocide of my tribe. And every tribe in this country has a time of horror. I mean, a time of absolute horror when they were confronted by this invader. And some have happened almost 500 years ago. But as they come across the plains, our time of horror came in the late 1800s, and we remember it very well.
In the frigid winter of 1890, Chief Bigfoot was leading a group of Lakota, mainly women and children, to shelter on the Pine Ridge Reservation. On the morning of December 29th, they were attacked by the U.S. Army on the banks of Wounded Knee Creek.
My great-grandmother is Katie Warbonnet. She was a survivor at Wounded Knee. When the shooting broke out, she and her sister got Kiksawi, ran down into the ravine and made it to some plum bushes. And she could hear the firing and hollering, and then finally it was quiet.
More than 300 Lakota people lay dead. After remaining untouched in the ice and snow for 3 days, they were buried in a mass grave. The massacre would mark the brutal end of centuries of armed Indian resistance. For those who came nearly 100 years later, Wounded Knee was sacred land.
I walked over to a gully and I picked up some sage and I went and washed myself and I prayed to those ancestors that were there in that gully. And I said, we're back. We've returned my relations. We belong.
This is where the television crews await the hour-by-hour events in Wounded Knee. This privileged position is protected by the Indian chiefs. Clearly, the chiefs are anxious that this rebellion and its outcome receive as much publicity as possible.
It would have been very simple for the federal forces to go into Wounded Knee and take over. There would have been some casualties, but probably the government would have considered them tolerable. What made it so interesting was that the Indians existed underneath a protective bubble of publicity and shame, because everybody knew that this was the site of the last massacre of the Indian Wars, and the last thing the government wanted to see was a massacre on the same site.
1 week into the siege, all 3 television networks had stationed reporters in Wounded Knee. Polls estimated that more than 90% of Americans were following the crisis on the nightly news.
If they came and killed all of us, it would be recorded and it would be seen by the world, you know, where the 1890 massacre wasn't. And if they didn't, if they decided, you know, that media was there so they don't want to murder all of us, well, then the media is there to tell our side of the story.
They wanted this stoic, you know, American Indian man with a gun. America's picture of the Indian. We didn't care, as long as the word was getting out.
Après 37 jours de conflit avec les autorités fédérales, les Sioux de Wounded Knee dans le Dakota du Sud.
There was a lot of folks here. A lot of foreign press were here. And they made it out to be kind of a cowboy Indian adventure, you know. More people wanted confrontation. That seemed to attract the viewers.
You guys get up so tight and start panicking, you get down on the press. And we want them to film this bullshit. They all heard them fire first with that open up with automatic weapons. Well, we got to get that film. So we got 22s in our hand against APCs. So don't be jumping on the press.
The news out of South Dakota held Indians around the country spellbound. Some were ashamed by Ames' armed display of defiance, but many were inspired.
I left school, and me and another guy left, and we drove in his car from, we were in Central California, and we drove up to Oakland, and from Oakland we drove back to South Dakota. Up until '73, when it started, I was never involved in anything politically, doing with either Native Americans or any other organization. I just felt like I should go up there, and I did.
You all are not Oglala Sioux, I take it.
I am.
I'm Chippewa. You Chippewa, where are you from?
Minnesota.
And what about you, sir? Where are you from?
Winnebago.
Wisconsin.
Cheyenne, Oklahoma.
And you're not necessarily all members of AIM, huh?
We didn't say that.
Oh, are you members of AIM? Let me
We didn't say that either.
We're here to support our Indian people that are in Wounded Knee.
This generation of Indians in the late 60s, early 70s, who for the most part, they've been to boarding school or their parents have been to boarding school, which was explicitly about getting Indians off the reservations, to not be Indian, to not speak their language. For those Indian people, there was this moment in which you could see on television, there was another way, there was another possibility. It was electrifying.
There is one dark day in the lives of Indian children, the day when they are forcibly taken away from those who love and care for them, from those who speak their language. They are dragged, some screaming and weeping, others in silent terror, to a boarding school where they are to be remade into white kids.
By the late 19th century, the Indian Wars were over. The United States seized on a ruthless strategy to assimilate native children to a subordinate place in white-dominated society. Government-run boarding schools.
I was 5 years old. My mother was crying and they were taking us off, and my sister Audrey, who also, you know, was like a second mother to me, and a very close friend as a sister. And my brother Mark, they were very sad. Within 2 hours or so after the buses filled up and we were down the road, this is the furthest I've ever been from my home in my life. And then, of course, it turns into evening and we arrive at this place.
I ended up in a place where nothing made any sense at all. You know, it wasn't home. It wasn't. I didn't know anything about school. Nobody ever told me anything about school. I didn't know what the education was. I remember that I wanted to go home. Period. I didn't want to be there. I just wanted to go home.
And we all had to strip down naked, and then they put the DDT on us. They line us up, they're cutting our hair. You have long hair, you have braids, and that gets cut off. And I would say within a matter of hour and a half, we're standing there, all looking alike.
Between the 1870s and the 1960s, over 100,000 Indian children were sent to one of the nearly 500 boarding schools scattered across the United States.
Through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
We couldn't sing any native songs or tribal songs. They just started using English. You could not use any other language. And we'd whisper it. Pass the Bequajigun, pass the bread over. It's like I had to be two people. I had to be Nawakumig, and I had to be Dennis Banks. Nawakumig is my real name, my Ojibwe name. Dennis Banks had to be very protective of Nawakumig. And so I learned who the presidents were, and I learned the math, I learned the social studies, I learned the English, and Nawakumig was still there.
This is education that was promised us, that was guaranteed us through the treaties. But it wasn't. It's torture, brainwashing. They called us many different names. Savage, dumb. And we got beat for looking like an Indian, smelling like an Indian, even speaking Indian. Everything I did.
Their de-Indianization program, it failed. But the toll was devastating. It destroyed our family. It destroyed the relationship we had with our mother. I could never regain that friendship, loveship relationship that I had with my mother. It wasn't there anymore. And that's what, to this day, I keep thinking that, you know, damn this government, what it did to me and what it did to thousands of other children across this country.
If the leaders at Wounded Knee are bent on violence, that is their concern. But I call upon them now to send the women and the children, both resident and non-resident, out of Wounded Knee before darkness falls tomorrow.
The United States government sent an ultimatum to the people in Wounded Knee that if they didn't leave on a certain day, that they were coming in. They would remove us by force.
We are going to reject any kind of conditions that pushes us out of the Wounded Knee area until all of the issues of the Oglala Sioux are met.
I told Dennis to burn it. And at that time, we all started making preparations for making that last stand.
We smudged everybody as they came up and painted them. When you go off to war, if you get killed in battle, then the paint will signify that you went there with the blessings of the pipe, and that you'll go to the spirit world with great honor.
I had this little bitty bag, little bitty fringes on it. I had one bullet in there, and I had a semi-automatic, and I only put one bullet in there, and somebody said, "How come one bullet?" I said, "I'm going to wait, because if I'm going, I'm going to take somebody with me."
The government just backed down on that 6 o'clock thing.
Beautiful.
2 days after issuing the ultimatum, U.S. officials shifted tactics. Hoping the occupation would simply peter out, they removed roadblocks around Wounded Knee and persuaded Dick Wilson to remove his. Federal officials would keep the inflammatory tribal chairman on the sidelines for the rest of the occupation. But when the roadblocks were lifted, new protesters and fresh supplies flooded in. On March 11th, revitalized occupation leaders made a startling announcement.
The leadership of the Oglala Sioux here present in Wounded Knee have declared Wounded Knee an independent country. From here further, if any spy from the United States of America is found within our borders, they will be dealt with as any spy at a time of war and be shot before a firing squad.
The battered hamlet of Wounded Knee was now the independent Oglala Nation. While U.S. officials hurriedly put roadblocks back in place, the new nation asserted its sovereignty. A delegation led by Chief Foolscrow traveled to the United Nations to put the Oglalas case before the world.
They arrived almost an hour late. They said taxi cab drivers just wouldn't stop to pick them up. Wearing a medal given to the tribe by the United States government after the signing of the Treaty of 1868, 78-year-old Chief Fool's Crow, through an interpreter, explained why the group came to New York.
It is our last effort in this trouble. I think we have exhausted all other means of a settlement of the trouble we have at Wounded Knee.
The delegation failed to get official recognition at the UN and returned to Wounded Knee. There, inside the borders of the independent Oglala Nation, the chiefs and medicine men introduced Lakota culture to the protesters, many of whom had come from cities and were disconnected from Indian traditions.
One of the first things that we did when we got into Wounded Knee is we built a purification lodge, a NEPI, a sweat lodge. And we all were required, everybody was required to go in there and purify themselves and to pray and ask the Creator for help. Everything that we did was preceded by prayer and gathering, smoking of the sacred pipe and tobacco offerings, everything.
The Indian movement was different than other political movements of the time because it defined itself as a spiritual movement. Their trajectory, in a way, mirrors what a lot of the Indian world was about, which was trying to connect with traditional knowledge, culture, religion.
One of the things that AIM tried to do was to return Indianness to all Indians, whether folks lived in the city, on reservations, whether they spoke the language or didn't speak the language. If you were Indian, you could return to the tribe.
Many of the protesters had left reservations behind, along with thousands of other Indians, as part of the federal government's Indian relocation program of the 1950s and 60s.
The government thought one way to solve the Indian problem was to relocate Indians from the reservation to the bigger cities. They couldn't kill the Indians anymore. That was out of fashion by the 50s. So they decided to experiment. They did a lot of experimenting with Indians. Relocation program was one such experiment.
It was exciting, relocation. You know, you get to go to a big city and they'll help you find a job, and you'll get to, you know, see the rest of the country. Of course, you weren't forced to go on relocation, but they made it look good. Streets paved with gold. We ended up in Cleveland, Ohio.
Over 100,000 Indians were relocated in just 15 years. The government promised to help them find schools, housing, and employment. But for many, the promise rang hollow.
They put us in a real dumpy motel, and I was just sitting there thinking, I wonder what's going on at home. I could just see the rolling hills and the small town. They're all just moving and walking and going real fast. Nobody's stopping to look around. That's why we stayed in our apartments or stayed in our rooms.
If you went and applied for a job, you better not tell them you're Indian. You better tell them you're French or you're some Italian or some other nationality. You wouldn't get the job.
By the 1970s, half of all Indians lived in cities. But the relocation program produced an unanticipated result.
it pulled us all closer together. We could always spot each other in the city. So if we'd see an Indian on the street walking down Market Street, we'd look at each other and we'd just smile and kind of shake our head, or, you know, an acknowledgement of each other. We didn't care what tribe anyone was. We were Indian people. We were a race.
The new pan-Indian identity led to the growth of activist groups around the country. The American Indian movement was the most radical.
There were a lot of native people that were afraid to stand up. Geronimo demonstrated, man. Crazy Horse demonstrated. And for us, the baby boom generation, circumstances were right. We could raise our voice.
Over the course of the siege, government forces would pound the village with more than 500,000 rounds of ammunition. It was inevitable that there would be casualties.
The Wounded Knee apparently has a wounded party. It really don't bug me that much. I really don't mind getting shot. We are willing to sacrifice our lives for our children so they will not have to grow up in the society we grew up in today.
Milo and myself got hit. We knew that no one was going to go through this completely unscathed. There was somebody that was going to get it again.
With the White House increasingly preoccupied with Watergate, the government had allowed the occupation of Wounded Knee to drag on. But at the end of March, the Justice Department sent a new negotiator who changed tactics.
Shortly after I arrived, the lifestyle was somewhat changed of the occupants of Wounded Knee. The electricity was cut off. The water line was cut.
Then Frizzell cut off the protesters' most vital lifeline. He ordered reporters to leave town.
Y'all get back to the cars, okay? Just get back to the cars till we get to word. Don't touch my hand either. Just get back to the car till we get to word.
I frankly think that the barring of the news media has had an effect on negotiations. A positive effect from the government's point of view, because
all of a sudden, those in Wounded Knee weren't seeing themselves on top of a pony waving an AK-47 at the American personnel on the ground.
Just when the siege was officially kicked off the airwaves, it got renewed publicity from an unlikely source, Hollywood.
That he very regretfully cannot accept this very generous award.
Marlon Brando refused his Oscar for Best Actor in The Godfather in protest of the negative portrayal of Indians in the movies.
Excuse me.
Brando sent an Apache actress named Sacheen Littlefeather to represent him at the award ceremony, watched by millions. Later, backstage, she explained Brando's absence.
I have indicated in this statement that Marlon Brando was on his way to Wounded Knee. At that time, you'll have to take me for his word.
Brando never made it to Wounded Knee. But a poll taken 4 days after the Oscars showed his sympathies were widely shared. Most Americans sided with the protesters. Within a week, the two sides reached a deal.
the siege of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, ended today.
Representatives of the Indians and U.S. Interior Department officials formally signed the pact this afternoon inside the embattled village.
Government officials promised to investigate corruption on Pine Ridge and to immediately convene a White House meeting and congressional hearings on treaty rights. For their part, the protesters agreed to lay down their arms.
You know, the first thing Indians do is break out a drum. You know, so they started banging the drum and singing victory songs, and everybody was hooping and cheering, and that was a time when we really thought we won. And not only that, we thought that we had survived.
I talked to Chief Foolscrow, an elder and a full-blood. I offered him a ride on my helicopter if he could get this young Indian lad to let me ride his pony. He thought it was a wonderful gesture, and I did the same as I galloped off on that pony bareback.
Chief Badcobb, Medicine Man Leonard Crow Dog, and Russell Means rushed to Washington for a meeting at the White House. But the deal quickly collapsed over the critical detail of what was to happen first: the White House meeting or the disarming of the protesters.
The White House will not negotiate while guns are pointed at federal officials in Wounded Knee. That is our position. I believe it offers the only hope for a peaceful solution, and I, for one, am prepared to stand by the agreement until hell freezes over.
If we give up our arms, hello? That is so stupid. It's beyond belief that they would even say that to the press. What? These stupid Indians are going to go to negotiate after they lay down their arms? What? Nobody does that in the entire world in history.
After the agreement unraveled, Russell Means was arrested. He would spend the rest of the occupation in jail.
Fun and games, so far as I'm concerned, are over. A United States Marshal has been seriously wounded.
Many of the some 300 persons in Wounded Knee are sick with bad colds. Doctors here report at least 15 persons have pneumonia.
The garbage is piling up. The food is running short. One meal a day is now the rule, and that's not much of a meal.
One time, one of the guys came in and he had a sack on his shoulders, and it was, I don't know, maybe a 50-pound bag of what they fed calves. So that's what we ate. We made pancakes out of it and whatever. We just treated it like flour.
We had been rationing ourselves to one meal a day, one full meal a day. We are cutting that effective today to a 1/2 meal a day.
At the time, I was minding my own business in Boston, following the Wounded Knee story in the news like everybody else. One day, somebody walked into my office that I knew within the Boston anti-war movement. They had heard that I was a pilot, and they needed somebody to go in there who could fly over the federal blockade and bring them some food.
If there's any plane comes by here today, we don't want anybody taking any pot shots at the things, because it's going to be making a food drop to us today.
We operated out of Rapid City, South Dakota, 3 o'clock in the morning. We were over Wounded Knee about 40 seconds, made the drop, and we were gone. And 2,000 pounds of food landed in the village.
At first, we thought we were being attacked. We thought they were gassing us, because what it was the flour exploding and creating a big cloud, but then all of a sudden, this is food, So we're all out there gathering the food, and the FBI opens up on us.
The night before, a man named Frank Clearwater and his pregnant wife had arrived in the village. Clearwater said they had hitchhiked all the way from North Carolina.
when he came in, he had his own gun. He had a kind of a big long-barreled shotgun. And looked like he came out of the hills too, you know. She said he was Cherokee, you know. He looked like one of those mountain men.
They had ready-made cigarettes, which was a very big deal because we were all smoking in those days, and we were smoking cherry bark and things from the ground. And here was a ready-made cigarette. And so I remember Frank Clearwater lit it up, and we passed it around in a circle like a form of communion.
When bullets began to fly on the day of the food drop, Frank Clearwater took refuge with other protesters in a church. As they hugged the floor in an effort to stay out of harm's way, a bullet tore through the plasterboard wall and struck Clearwater in the head. He had been in Wounded Knee for less than 24 hours.
A brother named Strawberry had his hand on the back of his head, and he was holding his skull. And I put my hand on his skull, tried to hold his brains in. And we took him in the clinic, and they couldn't save him.
The first death intensified the government's determination to bring the siege to an end. In mid-April, a unit was put on alert at an army base in Colorado. According to plans leaked to the press, the government was prepared to move into Wounded Knee with armored helicopters and tear gas.
The White House, the Department of Justice, were concerned with the confrontation going on all during the month of May into the summer. The college campuses, I was told, would be emptying out, and all the adventure seekers would be infiltrating Wounded Knee. I was given a 10-day deadline.
Officials were destabilizing the occupation using covert tactics.
I have some information I think that you'll be interested in, and it's based on a source that we have utilized in the past and has furnished us information in the past within Wounded Knee. Now, very frankly, I cannot identify him for obvious purposes.
There were almost surely spies within Wounded Knee. The U.S. government had infiltrated the American Indian movement like it had infiltrated every political organization in the U.S. during that time.
AIM knew that they had spies in their midst, and that was part of the FBI's game. Not just to have the spies to get information on what AIM was doing, but to get AIM guessing as to who those spies were, to get them paranoid and pointing fingers at one another.
What is that? What did you point at me?
One effect of that paranoia inside Wounded Knee is that there are purported cases of people who disappeared and who were thought to have been killed, mainly because people didn't know who they were and who assumed that they were spies.
I got daily reports. I got informer reports. This information came to me through the tribal government and through the FBI.
On April 26th, Wounded Knee sustained the heaviest barrage of gunfire since the start of the siege. When the shooting subsided, Buddy Lamont, a 31-year-old Oglala from Pine Ridge, came out to investigate. Lamont was a Vietnam veteran who'd been in Wounded Knee since the beginning.
Everybody started getting up and going back to about the normal routines, and Buddy got up and walked over to the trenches where we were at. A sniper at a good 1,000 yards hit him squarely in the heart. and he wasn't even aiming the gun. He had his back turned, you know, and his weapon was on his shoulder. You know, to me, that was murder.
Negotiators agreed to a ceasefire so that Lamont's family could bury him at Wounded Knee. On May 6th, Buddy Lamont was laid to rest next to the victims of the 1890 massacre.
They asked me if I would say a prayer for him, which I did. It said 2,000 people came and one remained.
Buddy Lamont's death becomes really the final blow to a lot of people inside Wounded Knee, especially the Oglalas from Pine Ridge. He was somebody that everybody knew his mom, and he was there for all the right reasons, fighting for something that he cared about. And for Buddy Lamont to die was more of a tragedy than most people could bear.
Fool's Crow and the other Oglala leaders had had enough. Despite AIM's objections, they insisted on bringing the occupation to an end. On May 8th, 1973, after 71 days, the siege of Wounded Knee was over. In final talks with the government, AIM leaders agreed to disarm and submit to arrest. But many of the protesters were already making other plans.
We asked the medicine man, we said, we want to get out of here. We don't want to leave no weapons here. So he says, we'll have a ceremony tonight and we're going to pray. So we prayed all night long.
We sang this American Indian Movement song. An honor song, a memorial song.
Soon it started getting cloudy. The night evening started raining, wind, rain, so they couldn't shoot the flares.
Lots of people walked out. The spirits had a lot to do with it. The one that brought us out was an owl. And every time he'd hoot in a direction, and then we'd go that way. And they did it right under the marshals' noses.
As the protesters fled Wounded Knee, a triumphant Dick Wilson toured the remains of the town.
Dick, are you surprised at what you're seeing?
I expected this.
Why?
They're hoodlums, clowns. This is the way they live.
Not only was Dick Wilson still firmly in charge, he would exact revenge on his opponents as the federal government looked the other way.
The Oglalas don't like what happened. And if the FBI don't get them, the Oglalas will. We have our own way of punishing people like that.
Shooting on the reservation?
You said it. We'll take care of them.
After Wounded Knee was a period of time that the dissidents called the Reign of Terror. It was a time when Dick Wilson truly unleashed his forces on the folks who had supported Wounded Knee.
In the 3 years following the siege, 2 FBI agents and more than 60 AIM supporters were killed, giving Pine Ridge the highest per capita murder rate in the country. As the reservation spiraled into violence, the government went after AIM in the courts.
One thing that Wounded Knee gave the federal government an excuse to do was to try to litigate the American Indian movement out of existence.
You and your bunch of hoodlums take over down there, you destroy people's property.
Within months, more than 500 indictments were brought against AIM members, most on minor charges that were later dismissed.
They succeeded in tying up AIM in court, and AIM at this point, with all those resources going into court, lost its way.
AIM fell into disarray and violent infighting, and would never again have the impact it had in 1973. But the hopes inspired by the siege would echo in the decades to come. Despite the chaos that followed in its wake, Wounded Knee would prove to be a turning point in the history of Native people.
We need to let the rest of the world know what was going on. 2 states over, they had no idea about Indian people. We were just invisible. We were the ones that kicked the doors open on the Indian issue and let the world see.
The good that came out of Wounded Knee was the entry into American Indian political life of people who had not been there before, who had not had a real voice. People learned they could tackle problems, create opportunities, and I think that coming out of Wounded Knee, people knew they could make a difference.
There was a lot of sense of we're important and we can do something within our own people, our own tribe, our own homes. I didn't go back to what I was doing before. I felt maybe I can do something to help not only my people, but other people too.
Native activism would spur the revitalization of Native cultures. In the years following the siege at Wounded Knee, Indians would create tribal schools and cultural institutions charged with preserving Indian traditions and passing them on.
In the late 60s and early 70s, these were still emerging ideas about reconnecting with traditional culture, language, religion. That was starting to happen. But this became the majority sentiment in the space of just a handful of years. It was really about identity. It was about affirming we're still here, we want to be here, and we want to be here on our own terms.
Whatever went on in the 60s and 70s, it's an extension, it's a continuation. It's no different than what King Philip was about, or Crazy Horse was about. And whatever means and manner we could, since the Europeans arrived here, we've had to fight for our survival.
What the 1973 occupation did was people started saying, hey, we're Indians. It's okay to be Indian. We are Indian. We really should be who we are. The struggle that we have in the 21st century is to remain ourselves. Every one of us has to do our part to remain Lakota, to remain Indian, and to teach our children, to teach our grandchildren, and make sure that there will be children sitting in Sweat Lodge, standing at the Sundance in 1,000 years.
Stay tuned for scenes from the next American Experience. But first,
this is what we were.